Are you tired of dealing with all that fabric when trying to quilt your project on your machine? Or maybe you're a hand quilter looking to make your quilting more portable. In this video, you'll learn about a Quilt As You Go method where you split your project into smaller, manageable sections for quilting. Then you'll find out about some tricks for sewing those sections together in order to cover up the raw edges on the back. At the end of the video, you'll also get a quick look at some other Quilt As You Go techniques. You might be wondering why most people avoid Quilt As You Go methods. One problem is the difficulty in matching these intersections and points after everything's been quilted. For example, after quilting each one of these blocks individually, you now have 3 layers of fabric here and 3 layers of fabric over here that you have to deal with when matching these points and intersections. Another problem with the Quilt As You Go method is dealing with raw edges. This might look good on the front, but not on the back. Something has to be done about this seam. One solution is to add a border around the block before quilting. It's much easier to match these points, and only 2 layers of fabric need to be sewn together. If the quilting is contained in this center area, then the fabric is loose in this border area on the front and on the back. Since this is loose, you can pin back a section so it doesn't get caught in this seam. This will allow you to come back in later and cover that raw seam. In the next sections, you'll get a more detailed look at this process. Like the name says, the Quilt As You Go border method involves adding borders to make it easier to join the sections together. The feature quilt in this video was divided along panel lines. 3-inch borders were added. The size of each section is determined by the quilter's preferences and by the design of the quilt. For example, a quilter might decide to border each block or a group of blocks. The width of the border also depends on a quilter's preferences. It can be wide or narrow, but should not be less than 1 inch wide. Next, you'll learn about assembling the quilt sandwich for each section. Always make sure that all fabric's been pressed before assembling the quilt sandwich. Your batting and backing should be cut at least 2 inches larger than the quilt top. You also need to press some of the raw edges of the backing sections. These areas have to be pressed because they will eventually hide seam allowances on the back. I used this old folder with a 1/2 inch marked to ensure my edges stay straight when pressing. Here's a diagram of how the sections will be sewn together and the edges that need to be pressed. The backing fabric for section number 1 is pressed on the right. Section number 2 is also pressed on the right and at the top. Section number 3 is pressed on the bottom. Section number 4 doesn't need to be pressed. I'll do this section first. Put the backing down with the wrong side facing you. On these 2 sides that will be sewn to the other parts of the quilt, line up the batting about 1/4 inch away from these edges. This helps to keep extra bulk out of the seams. When layering the top, you want to make sure that the top and the back match along these 2 edges. It's okay if you have a little extra batting or backing along these 2 edges. I'll baste the layers together using pins, but you might want to use basting spray, or if you're hand quilting, you'll hand baste with a needle and thread. Back number 2, I use tape to hold this down. It's not necessary, but it helps things from shifting when you lay your pieces. I'll be sewing this side and this side to other sections on the quilt, so I've moved that batting back about 1/4 inch from each one of these edges. The top and the back are lined up along this edge and also along this edge. Baste in place. Back number 3 gets pressed along this edge. The batting is placed a 1/4 inch from this edge and this edge. The top is aligned with the back along this edge and this edge, as this is where this section will be joined to the other sections. I pinned in place. Backing number 4 is the only section that does not have to have a 1/2 inch pressed. My batting is about a 1/4 inch away from this edge and from this edge. I've lined up the top with the backing along this edge and this edge. I'll quilt to the ditch here between the border and the panels. Then I'll add some quilting around these animals and maybe some straight lines just to fill in that background. I'll make sure to leave these borders free of any stitching. This will make it easier to get in here when I have to join these sections together. I quilted around the animal in each panel. I decided against that echo quilting, but I did stitch in the ditch and then added straight lines in the background. Quilting these smaller sections is so much easier than dealing with the whole quilt. And here are the quilted panels. After quilting, the panels are ready to be sewn together, as seen in this diagram. Before sewing the first 2 panels together, you'll need to pin back the pressed edge of panel number 2. This will ensure that it doesn't get caught up when sewing this seam. I put right sides together of panel number 1 and 2, lining up these edges, and then I'll pin through all 5 layers. Stitch a 1/4 inch seam. And don't worry if you get some of the batting caught. Remove the pins from the backing and then press. My seam's been pressed toward this pressed edge. Then I'll use this to cover up that seam. I hand sewed this piece down using an applique stitch. I left about 2 inches free on the end so I can get into this area later. I'll sew section 3 to 4 in the same manner as I did with section 1 and 2. After sewing a 1/4 inch seam, I press towards this backing, which can then be pulled down to cover up that seam. I covered the raw seam by appliquing the backing in place all the way across the seam. Now these sections are ready to be sewn together, but there's stitching between the borders, and remember you need about 1 to 2 inches free. Since this will be the last seam, you only need one side free on the back in order to cover those raw edges. In order to sew this section to this section and then have that loose backing to cover the seam, I'll need to remove about 1 inch of stitches here. You can see where I removed those stitches and I put a pin here to hold that in place. And now I can pin that backing away from that seam. I put right sides together, matching these edges. Line up these seams, pin, and then stitch a 1/4 inch seam. After sewing, I press my seams toward the pin backing. This little area where I pulled out the stitches, I'll come in and hand stitch that back together. Take out the pins and use this backing to cover that seam. I'll cover this seam and finish stitching here. Stitch the final section down the center. It's okay to use a whip stitch if you're not sure about the applique stitch. Notice when using this method, the 2 sections will not match up. Trim the excess backing and batting. And here's my completed quilt before binding. Here's a shot with the binding. There are many Quilt As You Go methods. In this section, you'll get a quick look at some of these. As long as you keep your quilting at least 1 inch away from the edges, you can pull back both your batting and your backing. This makes it easier to match those sections. After pressing, this excess batting has to be trimmed. The quilting designs and these blocks were kept an inch away from the edges. This frees up the backing so it can be used to cover that raw seam. This quilt was put together like the one appearing in this video. Borders were added, quilt sandwiches were basted, and then after quilting each section, these two sections were sewn together, then these two sections were sewn together. After sewing both sections together, I didn't have to remove the stitches in the center because a separate piece of binding was used to cover those raw edges. Some folks like to machine stitch that binding on the back, but just be aware that those stitches will show up on the front. Here's a sample of a quilt that I didn't worry so much about matching the sections, as it's loaded with areas that don't match. I divided it into 4 parts and quilted each section all the way to the edges. Then I sewed these 2 sections together and these 2 sections together. I used binding to cover the raw seams. These blocks are part of a larger quilt. After the borders were added, the squares were sewn together and readied for quilting as a 3-block section. This is a reminder that you don't have to quilt individual blocks. You can prepare a whole group of blocks as long as you keep these border areas free from quilting. Each block is quilted and then sashing is added on the front and the back. Then the blocks fit together like this. The rows are sewn to other rows using the same process but with longer strips. Hope you find a project so you can try out one of these Quilt As You Go methods. Adding borders to panels is a great way to get acquainted with these techniques. Let us know how it turns out. If you get a chance to visit learnhowtoquilt.com, check out our other Quilt As You Go videos. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and share our website with your friends. Thanks.